Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and over the past few weeks we've been seeing less and less major adjustments over to the PTR realms, which signals that 11.1 should be getting very close to an official release. Well, while we're not seeing too many talent adjustments, ability adjustments, we are seeing a bunch of tunings all across the board, especially for the class of warrior. Some classes are expected to be buffed up, others are expected to be nerfed, but it looks like warrior is just getting juiced all across the board, especially for specs like arms, and even more so for the spec of fury. Some of these updates are actually official updates that have been implemented over these past few weeks, but then there was also a sneaky little PTR hotfix that came in for a number of playstyles. Mostly improvements, which is good news, but for Fury Warriors in particular, for some reason they wanted to put that thing on steroids and take that playstyle all the way to an 11. So I really want to take a look at all of the newest updates that have hit the class of Warrior over the past few weeks over in 11.1 and talk about some of the different buffs that they've received all across the board and highlighting some of the other improvements that we've seen for specs like protection as well. As always, if you guys want to see more regular 11.1 class updates over on the channel, be sure to follow and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So both the DPS specs of the warrior are getting juiced up by quite a bit, and there's even more buffs. Not all of them have hit the blue post, but a bunch of new buffs have hit the PTR realms, at least internally. So we're expecting for warriors to be getting quite a decent bit of an overall gain, and there's just a lot of damage buffs across the board. It's very similar to how at the start of War Within, at least during the alpha and the beta, at some point they decided just to crank up the damage of warriors by all damage increased by 30% for both specs, and they went from like doing kind of decent-ish damage, struggling to keep up with everybody, to just being like, okay, this class walks in and just pumps numbers. So this might have a very similar effect. As for the spec of Arms Warrior, it looks like they're going through it and buffing up majority of the basic core kit, but also doing some new visual stuff as well. Majority of the damage is going to come to abilities like Mortal Strike, which has been getting amped up by quite a bit over the last few weeks, buffed up by 20% on top of it. Ability of Overpower, a basic ability that you use while Mortal Strike is on cooldown, also got buffed up by 20%, but so did the talent of Dreadnought as well, making it a lot better in AoE. What's also interesting though is previously when you buffed up the damage of your Overpower, it also buffed the damage of Dreadnought because Dreadnought damage is set to scale off of Overpower. So either, I guess my question is, does it double dip here? And I'm not exactly 100% sure, because normally when you buff up Overpower, Dreadnought naturally scales up, but it looks like they're buffing the damage of Dreadnought on top of it. Cleave also got buffed up by 10%, a very popular ability if you play around with the Colossus playstyle. Also, Execute damage buffed up by 10%, so even better overall finishing potential. Then they also buffed up the damage of the ability of Slam by 30%. Nothing huge, at least in Tooltip it's doing about 383,000 damage. Overpower is about 358, so it's actually a little bit higher than Overpower, but it doesn't have any talents that synergize off of it, so technically it's a better button now. Although there used to be a bunch of talents for Warrior that buffed up the damage of Slam, and now there's only a handful of them at the moment. Like Barbaric Training, where you get a little bit more damage and critical strike damage on your Slam, which I guess helps out in single target just a little bit more. Then there's also the Fervor for Battle, where if Cleave and Whirlwind hit 2 or more targets, you also slam your primary target. So I guess it does add in additional damage to the warrior even in AoE content, but for the most part the ability of Slam is just something you default to when all your major abilities are down, like your Overpowers are gone, no charges are available, Mortal Strike isn't available, all cooldowns are down, you don't need to refresh your bleeds, and you're still sitting on rage and you got an empty global, you just fill it with Slam just to spend some of that rage. So I guess it makes it just a little bit better. It's a 30% damage buff, but it's just really going to be decent single target gain, or I guess to some degree AoE gain thanks to Fervor for Battle, but mostly during like downtime. For Arms Warrior, they also changed up Colossus Smash and Warbreaker visuals, with Colossus Smash looking a little bit more tame, at least in comparison, with a Warbreaker looking a lot more different. It's been a mixed reaction from the community whether like one or the other, but at least as of this moment, this is what your Colossus Smash looks like. So I like that shield Kraken animation. I think that looks sick. Big fan of that altogether. But the actual Warbreaker animation is a little bit more involved. And I think I need to zoom out a little bit just so you can see the actual animation. And the functionality of Warbreaker changed a little bit. But this is what it looks like now. Yeah, so it's a very different animation compared to this massive slam that a warrior does that breaks everybody's armor. Now you have the slam rumble on the ground with axes coming down to drop down this executey look-at effect that breaks the enemy's armor for that Warbreaker effect. So it's a very involved animation. It's very intricate, but not everybody's been enjoying that one in particular. Just something about it just doesn't feel as visceral as the original Warbreaker, which was this massive stomp that a warrior did, shattering everybody's armor at once. This axe toss, or this axe falling down to execute a target, and this a little bit of rumbling on the ground, just doesn't feel quite as impactful as what players really wanted out of the ability. Yeah, it just doesn't quite hit the same way. It's lacking impact, I guess is the best way to put it. It is awesome, and I'm glad that they are updating warrior animations in general. I mean, even abilities like Spell Reflect look a lot different, and it's that same shield icon that gets cracked in half as you Colossus Smash or Warbreaker the target. That's really cool to see. But this one just doesn't quite connect with the community, and hopefully at least they'll give it like a glyph where you can go back to the original Warbreaker if that's what you enjoy. So if you like this new animation, you could roll with it, or if you like the original one for a bit more impact, you can go back to that one and play your warrior and enjoy the visuals that you prefer. Either way though, Arms Warrior feels really good on PTR right now. This Cleave playstyle plus combined together with Colossus, which I'm really digging that playstyle, combined together with Demolish and how many buffs it done to Mortal Strike. I mean, you're encouraged to cleave and Mortal Strike a ton as this playstyle in particular. I think I prefer it more over Slayer. Slayer is cool. Slayer is awesome. I just love the massive impact, high damage output that Colossus has been able to do so far. And I've been seeing a lot of players playing Colossus on the PTR. I don't know if that'll be the meta pick or the best pick going forward, but it's been a very fun combination altogether. Although Arms pales in comparison when it comes to their popularity, comparing them to Fury Warriors, which is one of the most popular, for very good reason, of melee specs in the game, generally speaking. And they've saw a bunch of buffs all across the board, very similar to Arms Warriors. No new animations, you're not going to see any kind of Warbreaker Colossus Smash type of synergy for Fury, but a bunch of damage buffs all across the board for sure. Things like your Rampage buffed up by 20%, so it's just additional raw damage. Your Rage and Blow damage has got buffed up by 20%, Bloodthirst by 20%, Crushing Blow whenever you're playing around with the Reckless Abandon, also buffed up by 20%. On top of it, and I'm actually going to spec into this just so I can show you some of the other buffs that came out as well. Crushing Blow itself saw a 20% damage buff, so the ability hits a little bit harder because it's a separate ability than your Rage and Blow. It's just a different button altogether whenever you pop your new version of Reckless Abandon. Oh, but I guess if you haven't kept up with Warriors for 11.1, I should also add this. Reckless Abandon got changed quite a bit. So the damage of Bloodthirst and Crushing Blow is going to be mostly part of the anger management playstyle, where you're playing around this sustainy version of recklessness, where you're more focused around getting more critical strike chances and getting a lot more resources with a ton of rage generation, not having nearly as much burst, but a lot better sustained damage, drawn out damage. Whereas Reckless Abandon changes it completely, where Recklessness, instead of getting better cooldown reduction and more uptime, now it's a 1.5 minute cooldown that deals high impact damage. Crushing Blow deals additional critical strike damage. Bloodbath puts a bleed on the target. So it's like a very different playstyle of just burst damage with around Recklessness on a 1.5 minute cooldown, or more of a sustained based playstyle around Recklessness, but more with like a sustained based kit. And as part of Reckless Abandon, both Crushing Blow and Bloodbath get buffed up. Crushing Blow, like I said, 20%, Bloodbath by 20%, but also mostly for its instant damage, not the bleed aspect whatsoever. So they're mostly just buffing up the instantaneous damage of both of those abilities. And outside of that, they also buffed up Odin's Fury by 15% to make sure that this button doesn't fall too far behind. We've actually seen Fury Warrior builds recently that have been dropping Odin's Fury, playing around Mountain Thane, together with Champion Spear, in fact. So it feels like it's a better version of Odin's Fury. Throw that together with a Ravager, and then you're doing quite a bit of additional damage as of this moment. So that was the initial buff to the Fury Warrior kit, and it was pretty decent at first, But then some way, somehow Blizzard decided to add up a bunch of new hotfixes over on the PTR. No idea if these hotfixes are going to stay or not. They could potentially remove them tomorrow or next week or next PTR build, but they snuck in a bunch of new buffs for warriors. It was a couple of buffs for classes here and there, but then there's like a huge bag of buffs for Fury in particular, where they're buffing them further. So initially, basic combat abilities buffed up by 20%. On top of it though, now Fury's Execute is going to be buffed up by 50%. So you're probably looking at Slayer, look at that execute damage potential. Looks like Slayer might be making a bit of a return going forward. Bloodthirst further buffed up by 15%. Bloodbath from your Reckless Abandon buffed up by 20% as well, but they changed up the damage of the bleed effect. Normally, whenever you bloodbath at a target, you put up also a bleed on the target, and that bleed can continue stacking itself, or the over 6-second bleed continues to ramp up and ramp up and ramp up. Apparently, they changed it so now the bleed ticks every 3 seconds instead of 1 second. The ability of Rage and Blow on top of the original 20% and saw another 20% damage buff. Then Crushing Blow got changed up a little bit, so now it's also buffed up by further 20% more, but also now has a 20% crit damage component instead of 10% base crit damage component. So as you hit with Crushing Blow, and if it crits, normally did 10% more damage, now it's doing 20%. So now a crit-based gameplay for Fury Warrior with a high burst focus now becomes a little bit more of a reality, which synergizes pretty well with Recklessness because it does artificially increase your crit chance by a little bit more. So that becomes even more of this burst crit damage synergy that you can now play with Crushing Blow. Also, finally, the ability of Rampage saw a 20% damage buff as well on top of its initial damage buff. So Warrior just got juiced up by quite a bit, especially as a spec of Fury. And this change should make the Reckless Abandon build and playstyle a lot stronger compared to the anger management one, because it was looking like this is more or less what the build looked like for Fury Warriors here as of recently, at least when it comes to Mythic Plus. And some of those Mythic Plus builds do transition pretty well into raid builds, because especially if there's a cleave fight, Fury Warrior generally ends up being an excellent cleaving spec in overall. But yeah, heading forward, this is right now, at least on PTR, is what it seems like a pretty popular choice pick going forward for Fury, at least as of this moment. But this was before any of these new amps towards Reckless Abandon, where Fury Warriors were mostly focused on Bloodthirsting, Rage and Blowing, and going for Rampage while getting supplemental damage from Mountain Thane. But now it looks like they're buffing up that actual immediate damage even further with Reckless Abandon, but also the buff to Execute makes you think that maybe Slayer could be making a bit of a return. Plus, you could also combine Slayer burst damage, like as you Blaze Storm against the target, you put up a damage debuff with Overwhelming Blade, so enemies take more damage from your ability, and then you could just unleash the most amount of burst after a big Blaze Storm. This could give him a very strong burst focused playstyle, and overall should make the spec feel fairly strong and should have all its abilities synergized really well together for this mad burst output, crit damage synergy. Maybe combine Champion Spear into that to just deal the most amount of crit damage and give your warriors some insane burst output, at least during this 1.5 minute window. Safe to say there's a lot of possibilities as to where the Fury Warriors could go forward, but they definitely got juiced up by quite a bit. This Raging Berserker, this Goliath, this Colossus is now juiced to the nth degree and should be able to put up quite a bit of a punch, which makes me very excited about Fury Warriors on overall. I would have loved to see Warriors get some kind of like a utility buff, especially for Mythic Pluses, because I feel like that's usually what it comes down to is, yeah, you can bring a warrior, or you can bring like a rogue or a demon hunter or like a hunter or a variety of other classes, because they bring more utility than that of warrior on average. Warriors are excellent within raiding environment, but I feel like sometimes they just don't quite feel as strong as an option for a melee DPS within Mythic Pluses. This damage burst is definitely going to help them out a little, but I do wonder if they could potentially give him some sort of a dungeon-specific utility as well in order to make him more preference, because that, if they could have some kind of utility that made him better for dungeons, I think could make him a very strong competitor in Season 2 overall. Now, as Arms and Fury are getting juiced up all across the board, with Protection Warrior, it's more them spending time to try to clean up their initial mess with the spec. And I'm not saying that in a bad way specifically, but what they did with Prot to try to reduce its overall, I guess, active gameplay in terms of its rage generation, ability resets for shield slams and stuff, I mean, it wasn't really embraced by the community by any measure whatsoever. Not a lot of players were really excited about the changes that were coming out to Protection Warrior. Yeah, they're a little bit spammy of a playstyle, but a lot of players like not having your rage bar be limited by any of the mechanics, and not getting as many shield slams resets just didn't feel great whatsoever. So there were, while technically they were able to adjust Protection Warrior's resource management and make it a little bit more of like a mechanic you paid attention to rather than being constantly flooded by it, it actively made the experience for many players on PTR feel worse. So they're trying to clean up a lot of that mess and trying to react to a lot of the player feedback. So certain talents and chain abilities are going to be adjusted. Certain class talents such as barbaric training, for example, no longer increase the rage cost of revenge, just simply increases damage by 25%. So when it comes to you trying to manage your rage, this actually may be a better option if you're focused for some sort of a rage or revenge focused AoE build. The damage of execute also got up by 10%, which could be pretty solid too. And if you're playing around with the massacre playstyle, or rather not massacre, but like Juggernaut, for example, and I'm missing the talent here, sudden death, this could maybe be pretty good, as Protection Warrior's execute damage could be fairly strong. The talent of Frothing Berserker has also been adjusted to now give Revenge a 20% chance to immediately refund 50 of its rage spent. So this is kind of how they're trying to give Protection Warriors a little bit more rage generation, not necessarily by just making abilities generate more rage, but Revenge has a chance to refund its rage spent instantly, so that could be reinvested back into defenses, this could be reinvested back into offenses, and this allows you, hopefully with regular uses of Revenge, to at least regain a little bit more rage through basic gameplay. Your tier set has also been changed in order to make it a little bit beefier, like the actual 2 set bonus with the buff damage of luck of the draw. That is now going to be increasing the damage by 50%. Instead of for 10-second damage buff, it's now a 12-second damage buff. So it's a slightly bigger damage buff for you to be able to get better output. The 4 set itself with shield charge CD reduction is now increased to 12 seconds instead of 6 seconds, since you don't get as many shield slam resets. They're trying to make this tier set a little bit more valuable, so doubling up on its value for the 4 set to give you more shield charge resets is a lot better. It should help you out, at least when it comes to basic mitigation, because shield charge can grant you things like shield block, revenge costs no resources, and can also fuel you full of resources by giving you 20 rage plus a little bit extra control on primary target, instantaneous damage, which could be really good for holding down the fort, and generating rage for, or generating damage in order to keep aggro. Those things are all generally pretty helpful. They also changed up strategies in terms of how that functions with your shield slam resets. Initially, that was about a 30% chance, which felt it was pretty active. They dropped it down to a 20%, which felt sluggish. And now they raised it back up, or maybe they dropped it down to lower than 20 at some point, but they raised it back up to 25. So Devastate, Thunderclap, Revenge, and Execute to have a 25% chance to reset the main cooldown of Shield Slam. So it's slightly higher chance to reset it back up. I feel like give it a little bit of time and we'll probably go back to the Shield Slam resets being closer to 30. I almost feel like they should raise it by a couple more percent just so it doesn't feel nearly as bad. I know they're trying to reduce the uptime of Shield Slam resets, but it's one thing that I really enjoy about Protection Warrior, and I know they really don't like how it's an ability that ends up kind of cannibalizing rotation because it's the highest priority ability, the most amount of resource generation, but it still feels really good to just shield slam as protection. It's like my favorite part. So when you get those shield slam resets, it just does good things to my brain, honestly. They also did something cool, which I think is really nice. You know how Fury or Warriors in general, at least protection, can be very like tied to the weak auras, and like things like your ignore pain, for example, to track that properly can sometimes be a bit of a pain. Not always enjoyable, because it's just, well, you need a weak aura in order to be able to track Ignore Pain, because the ability itself is very specific. It allows you to consume rage in order to create a shield that ignores 50% of damage taken up until a certain amount, and that amount can be capped to from 1.4 million per use to 4.4 million total damage prevented. So you can't just build up a bunch of rage and then slam through your Ignore Pain and then just build up a huge shield. But you can actually see how much of Ignore Pain is left over when it's at 99. So this number right here with Ignore Pain in your actual, like, it's a buff, but also it's in your personal resource window. It shows you how much of your Ignore Pain you are at. So if, let's say, it says 100%, you are at your Ignore Pain cap. So if it says 100%, you don't really need to refresh it. You can just take some damage, let it be consumed a little bit, and as you have it be consumed, you'll see the number go down little by little, which is a really good mechanic. Normally you need a weak aura to be able to track it, otherwise nothing in game tells you exactly where you are. So as I take damage from this train dummy right now, you can actually see that number go down. So this gives me some actual visual much needed information about my protection warrior in terms of where I'm at with my ignore pain. It tells me when it's a good idea for me to refresh it, because normally without a weak aura, you might just end up spending that rage and refreshing it when it's already at a cap. And there's just not much you can do. Part of the playstyle of Protection Warrior is that balance of knowing how to spend your rage. Sometimes you'll send it into some revenges, sometimes you'll send it into ignore pain, and knowing how to optimize that ignore pain is very important. And that's basically nearly impossible without the use of weak auras. It's just not effective, it's not efficient. But now it can be for a newer player jumping into the game, like you know more or less where your ignore pain is. So you know, like, okay, my ignore pain is getting really low. I think I need to spend a little bit of rage in order to buff it back up by a little. Maybe you're taking a bunch of damage. That visual number tells you more or less exactly how much damage and how fast you're taking that damage. Or if, let's say, you're not taking a lot of damage, it allows you to safely spend a lot of the rage into revenge until ignore pain is about to fall off. And that's like the only time you really need to press the ability. Otherwise, you can spend majority of rage just spamming up the button, and allows you to track it much better. As long as it doesn't hit 0, you have at least a little bit of ignore pain, so you know where your cap is. It allows you to just like use that rage aggressively, use that rage offensively more than anything. This is a really good change. I'm a big fan of Blizzard being able to do that, and I feel like other games, especially like Final Fantasy XIV in particular, does a great job of letting players know their personal like bonus class resource. Like for Protection Warriors, knowing how much ignore pain you have is very important. It's a pretty big key component of your overall playstyle. So the fact that we don't have like an extra UI element or extra bar or some kind of like a animation of like a shield naturally baked into the game that tells us that info, I feel like it's still a bit criminal. Maybe Blizzard might need to think about doing stuff like that in the future. I know the players can create their own kind of visual presentation for these resources. While you can't do it with weak auras, for a brand new player jumping into a class, I think it helps out so much to have some kind of numbers or some kind of data, or like this just number next to ignore pain gives you an idea of where your ignore pain is, and it's such a good change. I'm a huge proponent of stuff like this, to have that in-game baseline without the need of external resources to be able to track those things, and I gotta give him credit. That's a really good change overall. I'm a huge fan of that altogether. But I guess time will tell exactly how the class ends up leveling out. Big fan of the visual adjustments though. We definitely just see more stuff like this in the game. The easier they can make some of those aspects of picking up a class and playing it fairly well, if not optimally, the better. And really want to see more stuff like this in the future. Definitely gotta give them props on that one specifically. But as always though, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and hope you guys did enjoy this video. If you did enjoy this update or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community where we'll be going over all of the newest updates regarding patch 11.1 as it hits the PTR realms. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.